So for the next series of videos, we're going to be using a collection of classes that follow this little inheritance tree here. And also a class called the featured spot. So this collection of classes is meant to describe a collection of items that you would sell maybe on like an online retailer, like a large online retailer that sells basically everything, right? So you can start with a very generic type of sorry, lowercase g, generic, just meaning a general kind of object I'm calling an item. And this is an abstract class. So this is a very simple class. It's just described by a name. We just have getters, setters, an equals method, and a compare to that just compares on the name. Okay, so this is a very simple class. I also do implement comparable in this class. Okay, so that's that kind of top of my inheritance tree. Then I have two more specific kinds of items that are going to be sold in this online marketplace: clothing and a book. Clothing is also an abstract class. So this is clothing is also an abstract class. Inside of clothing, I define an enum, small, medium, large, and I have an enum called size, and I have an instance data variable of type size. So I just have my clothing constructor takes in the name and the size and passes that back up to the item constructor, then initializes the size. In my toString method, I just add on the size information, and we'll come back to compare to another time in a little bit. And then I have the book class, which extends item. This is a concrete class, not an abstract class. And here I just add one variable. I add on the author. Okay, so I've got my getter and setter for that, and I add that onto the toString as well. And then I also have a concrete class that extends clothing called shirt. Again, these are purposely kept very, very simple, where I just add on a color. So my shirt constructor takes in the name, size, and color, calls the parent constructor, and then initializes color, and just adds on an RGB printout to the toString. Okay, so very, very simple classes. Again, you can imagine that in a realistic setting, there'd be way more that describes all these objects and also way more classes in the hierarchy than this. But I just wanted to have a simple hierarchy of objects that we can use. Okay, so keep this in mind again, and you can refer back to this as we use these classes. So our top of our tree is item, and then item has two child classes, clothing and book. Item and clothing are both abstract, and then clothing has one child class, shirt. Okay, so those are my classes that we're going to be using. Then we have a class called the featured spot. The feature spot. Okay, so now what this feature spot is you can imagine that there's maybe one item featured on this particular online vendor's website, and it's featured for a certain amount of time. So you can say, we sell everything, but right now this is our featured item. There's some sort of deal on it or some sort of sale, or we're just trying to encourage the selling of it or highlight it or whatever it is. It's the featured spot. Okay, it's kind of the highlighted item. So this is a feature spot, but it's a generic type. Okay, so right now it's a generic type. So we're going to be featuring things, but we could be featuring anything, right? We might be featuring an item or a shirt or a book. Like, we don't know what we're going to be featuring. Okay, so right now we're just using a generic type. So I'm declaring that generic type of type T. My instance data for my feature spot is just the item itself. And then I'm using a class called local time that allows me to specify a time. So that'll be when the featuring starts and when it ends. And then I'm also just going to keep track of how many items have been featured on this spot. Okay. When I create a featured spot, there's not going to be anything featured yet, so the count is going to be 0. I'm just going to set the item to null. And then there's a method called feature item where I pass in the item and however many minutes I want to feature the item for. So when inside this method, I update my count, I update my item, and I update my start time to be right now. And then I update my end time to be that many minutes from now. Don't worry too much about this timing syntax. We're going to cover that a little bit later in a future module when we talk about Java 8. There's some really useful and great timing classes that were added in Java 8. So we're going to use them now. Don't worry too much, though, if you're not quite sure about the syntax yet. Although they are designed to be pretty straightforward and obvious, and they're actually very, very user-friendly. So hopefully they make a little bit of sense, even if they're new to you. So again, notice that we're using this generic type as our type parameter here, right? We're taking in whatever that formal parameter type is. We're going to take that into this method, and that's going to be the type that's featured. Okay. We have a Boolean, is anything featured right now, which basically just tells if we're in the middle of this feature period, and if so, then something's being featured. If not, it's not. We have a getter, which is going to return the current item that's being featured. The return type for that is T. That's our generic type. We just have a getter for the start and the end time. And then in our toString, we say, well, if nothing's being featured, we're just going to say there's nothing being featured in this time. Tell how many items have been featured previously. If something is being featured, we'll print out the item that's being featured, print out how many more when it's going to end, and then print out the count. Okay. Okay, so that's our feature spot class. Take a look through this and make sure this use of generics makes sense. Okay, so again, where it's a generic class because we want to be able to say, well, we don't know what we want to feature. We might want to have a feature spot particular to our clothing department. So that feature spot's only going to be able to hold clothing items. Or maybe we have a feature spot that's it's the featured book of the day, and so it's only going to hold books. Or maybe we have a feature spot that's going to hold items, and it's just kind of the website-wide item of the day. It might be a shirt, it might be a book, it might be a car, right? It could be anything. So we don't know what kind of elements are going to be featured. We want to be able to create different feature spots, and so to do that, we're going to use the generic type. Okay, so again, look through this class, spend a couple minutes with it, make sure it makes sense. And let's open up I'm calling it the storefront class. Hang on one sec, let me comment some of this out. Okay, sorry about that. So this is my online storefront. So I'm just going to create a couple different items that we can use. I'm going to create a book and then 2 items of clothing, both going to be shirts, because remember, clothing is an abstract class. I'm going to create a child's tee and a men's button down. Okay, and again, obviously this tree could be much more complex than I've got it. I'm just keeping it simple right now, just to kind of, again, keep it simple in our mind, because I really just want to use these classes to highlight generics. So we're going to create a feature spot that holds items. Okay, so here we're going to say, all right, this is our main feature. This could be, it can hold an item and any type of item. This is going to be kind of our main featured item on our website. So we want to say that it can hold any item. It could hold a clothing, a book, a shirt, anything that we sell, anything that inherits from item could be featured. Okay, so this is how we do that, right? We just say our feature spot holds an item. So I'm going to create the feature spot, and then I'm going to feature the book item for 60 minutes. Print that out. Then I'm going to change the feature item to the clothing item 1 for 60 minutes. And don't worry about this part. This is just sort of slowing things down so that we can see the print, because otherwise it happens so fast it won't see it. We'll eventually learn what this code means, but for now, don't worry about it. I'm just slowing things down so we can see our print, our items being featured. So here we go. We have a featured item. I print the main feature here. It's the book being featured. It's going to be featured until this time. And here we go. Then again, I print it out again. Now it's the child's tee being featured until that time. And there have been 2 items featured now. Okay, so that's creating a feature spot. We could create, that's again our main feature. This is on our main website. Now we can create a second separate feature spot that's going to hold clothing. Let's say our clothing department has its own featured item. Okay, so this one we're going to use clothing as our type to send it into our type parameter. So this feature spot can now only feature clothing. So if I try to invoke feature item with my book, I'm going to get a compiler error. Okay, because it's going to say, hey, the closed feature spot can only feature clothing and you're trying to give me a book. That's not allowed. So that's going to give me a compiler error. Okay, I can feature the clothing item too, which is good. That's what I want to be able to do. And so let's print out our closed feature. So there we go. It says, okay, the featured item is the men's button down. There's been 1 item featured. Okay. Now, what'll happen if I change the declared type of clothing item 2 here to an item? Well, of course, this will still compile, right? Because I can declare something as type item and instantiate it as a shirt. That's allowed because shirt is lower on our inheritance tree, so that's okay. But the problem is the compiler now only knows that the declared type is clothing item 2, and so it's trying to pass an item. I'm sorry, the compiler only knows that the declared type is item, and so it's trying to pass an item when it can only accept a clothing. So that is not going to work, and you'll see the error there, that the argument item, that the type of item is not acceptable to send in when you think it's clothing. Even though we can see that it's instantiated as a shirt object, its actual type is shirt, but remember, compiler only cares about declared type. So that is not going to work. So because the declared type is not compatible with clothing. Okay. Okay, so let's put that back to clothing, and then we'll be okay. Could also be shirt. Shirt would be okay too, right? If I declare this as a shirt, that would be okay too. Okay, because a shirt is a clothing. It's lower on the inheritance tree. Now, of course, with the way we've defined our generics here, we can put any type into the feature spot, right? So I could say, well, okay, I'm going to feature a string. I'm going to make this word feature hold strings. I'm going to feature the string hello. And there we go. I can feature the string hello. And that will be allowed, right? Because string is a class, so that's okay. But does that really make sense? Do I really want to be able to feature anything? Or do I only want to restrict my feature spot to holding the elements in this hierarchy? That's really what I want, right? I'm not just featuring any old thing. I'm only featuring the items that I sell in my store or things below it. Okay, so any compatible item. So what I can do is I can use a bound. I can go back to my feature spot class and I can say, I don't just want to have any generic type here. I only want to have types that extend item. So this will allow me to say, okay, with my feature spot, I can pass in an item or anything compatible with item, which means anything lower on the inheritance tree. So I will now be able to create a feature spot with items, clothing, shirt, or books, but I now can no longer create this feature spot with a string. And that's a good thing, right? I don't want to be able to feature a string. That doesn't make any sense. So this is now going to not be allowed. Okay, so that's how I can again use that bounding to make my, in this instance it's in a class, to restrict the types of items that are allowed, the types of classes that are allowed to be passed in for that generic, that formal type parameter. Okay, so here I'm allowed to create a feature spot that holds items because item is compatible with item, it's the same class, and I'm allowed to create a feature spot that holds clothing because clothing is compatible with item. Clothing extends item, so that's allowed. If I were to change this to be T extends clothing, then I would no longer be able to create this feature spot because item is not compatible with clothing. It's higher on the tree. Okay, so what I'm specifying here is, again, I'm specifying the upper bound. It means the actual type that I'm going to pass in can be this class or anything lower on the inheritance tree. Okay. So again, take a look at this class, both the storefront class and the feature spot class and the object classes, and make sure that what the example I just walked through makes sense, because we're going to be using these classes to look at the more complicated topics of bounding. And so make sure that the examples as they stand right now are very clear and make sense to you before we make things even more complex.